Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Small Nonprofit Podcast. Today, it's double trouble. You have two Marias. Hey, Maria. Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes. Hello. This is such a joy and honor to be here. I am Maria Bryan. I'm a career-long storyteller and at the moment, trauma-informed storytelling trainer.
What is a trauma-informed storytelling trainer?
Great question. So, a couple of years ago, I had a student ask me how trauma informed storytelling works into my framework and had that same question. What the heck is trauma informed storytelling? So, what it means to be a trauma informed storyteller means that you are gathering and telling difficult, sensitive stories, likely stories that involve some kind of trauma in a way that promotes safety and resists harm.
I'm a huge fan of dignified storytelling and trauma-informed storytelling, so I'm really excited to dig deep into this topic. How did you get started on this path?
Well, really, it was me. It's funny. A few things happened at the same time. One is that I was just Googling. I feel like I should have a good answer for when someone asks me. I was teaching just very general nonprofit marketing at the time, but what if people are telling stories of really vulnerable folks and really, really vulnerable issues? And the trauma informed world is very, very new. We really only started studying this in the 90s. And connecting the dots between being trauma informed and storytelling is even more new. And actually, Cody Hayes, who is a nonprofit, phenomenal nonprofit marketer, just at this time, and it's so funny how this happens. He's like, Maria, I have a client and their work is really sensitive. The work they do is really sensitive. Do you have any resources on trauma informed storytelling? And I was like, that's weird because I've been Googling this. So Cody and I were like, we need to figure this out. So we got certified together in trauma and resilience. And so he was one of the first people in my life that's let's figure this out. And more people have come to this table. So this is how that kind of started. And what happened, Maria, is I was like, you know what? I feel enough urgency around this that I cut my services, like my direct services, and my consultancy right now is fully on being in conversation because it's messy and nuanced and it's not always black or white. There's so much gray in this. So, trying to have a deeper understanding of trauma, of what it means to be trauma informed, and how can we make this accessible for storytellers? Because there are unicorns, but generally speaking, the marketers, the fundraisers, the communicators, those who are doing videography and podcasting, they don't have a social work background, right? But yet they are still holding space for folks that have experienced trauma. And they are crafting stories for audiences that have experienced trauma. So that's really what I'm passionate about and what I do is let's think about how we can promote safety in this space and let's mitigate all the harm that's already been done because trauma truly is insidious and pervasive.
I find that a lot of organizations approach it very haphazardly, right? They're like, oh, we do trauma informed programming because we don't ask for demographic data. And for me, I have PTSD, right? Like that's not anything. That's not anything, right? Not thinking about things like consent, which are very important in collecting stories, collecting demographic data, like autonomy. I like when you said it's not black and white. Well, trauma people could see things as very black and white. So really trying to center those experiences and collect information in that way can be so valuable. And it's usually not a very like thoroughly thought out process. So I'd love to hear like the main things that you think people should be looking out for when they're telling stories. Or maybe let's start with the collection of the stories first.
Right. So, yes, it's nuanced, but there are tactical, practical things you can do. And I think of the storytelling process in three phases. Yes, the story gathering and collecting, and
Mhm.
then the story crafting, and then the story distribution. For story gathering, I would say first and foremost, story readiness. And this is where you're really partnering with those in your organization, if it's available, who are
Mhm.
maybe more trauma responsive, who actually have the license and has a more deeper understanding of, I think these folks in who we've served are ready to tell their story or have the emotional support in order to tell their story. So that's first, really. Is this person even ready to tell their story? Even if it's an incredible story, they might not be ever really ready to tell their story. Consent. I love that you brought up consent. Consent is more than immediate consent form. And honestly, even that is something a lot of organizations don't do. So consent is something that happens throughout the storytelling process, but most definitely when you're first just asking if folks want to tell their story. And consent isn't just, yes, I'll share my story, but how much of the story do they want to share? Do they want their name, or is there a different kind of identifier? What kind of images are you going to use? One of my favorite things emerging in consent is having an expiration date on stories. So after 2 or 3 years, these stories come down and you have to ask for consent again. Because maybe folks are ready to tell their story now and it's part of their healing process. But 3 years from now, they just don't want that story up anymore. They don't want to answer any more questions that come up. So consent is really important. And then when you're crafting, there are so many decisions that we can make as a storyteller. Sometimes folks will say to me, we serve folks that are so transient or that they really don't have this clear cut transformation. Like, I don't know how to tell this story in a way that's trauma informed. But there are things that you can do. First of all, it's okay to talk about pain, right? We're not going to move the needle in our mission if we're not honest about pain and trauma that exists in our communities. But we can do so in a way that is still respectful and dignifies the story owner. And also, we don't need to share all the details. Typically, people know when you're talking about intimate partner violence, they know. You don't necessarily have to go into the details of what that is. And I think it's really important to find some kind of transformation, no matter how small, right? Also, you have choices on the language you use. Are you using language that maybe we've been using for decades, but really is offensive and stigmatizes the community? Are we using asset or strengths based messaging? So, are we looking at what our community does really well, right? Instead of just writing in a way where we all take pity on this story owner. For those of you that are creating video or any kind of multimedia, you have music choices and audio choices. So you choose whether you're going to have beeping hospital monitors or B-roll of chaos and violence, right? These are all things that impact the audience and how they're going to receive the story. I think it's really important in that process to bring other folks in to review it. Like folks like you, Maria, that might have that trauma experience that will say, oh no, that sound or that B-roll or that language is upsetting in some way. And then of course the review process, which I just started to alluding to, who is part of that review process? Can the story owner take part in reviewing? What leadership? I was just talking today with a group of folks about actually creating a committee that is there for ethical and trauma informed storytelling. So this is the group when you're creating that big gala video that's going to be in front of 500 people. We have this group that already cares about this and has insight on it. So let's make sure that we build that, them reviewing this into the process. I'm going to take a breath because this is so much information for folks. But when it comes to distribution, this is really important too. Consent doesn't stop once folks are done telling their story, right? We want to make sure that we are choosing platforms that the story owners are abundantly aware of. If there is an event and your story owner is telling a really vulnerable story and they don't understand or know that it's being live streamed, right? And like that damage that can have. Or they've agreed to have it on social media, but you're not really monitoring it or moderating it, and it can get out of hand. And also, if other journalists pick up on a story, right? And then you have a lot less control. How are you being involved in how that story takes on a life of its own? I talked about story retraction, right? So, like, maybe we set expiration dates or we just make it very easy, a pathway very clear for a story owner to say, hey, it's been up for a year. It was a really great experience, but now I'm realizing that this comes up when employers Google my name. This comes up when people are dating me for the first time and I don't want them to know about this part of my story yet. These are all real things that have happened, right? So let's have clear pathways for folks to retract their story. And finally, Maria, we are human. And so, as much time that we spend on our values and these processes and protocols, we will mess up, right? Because we have our blind spots. And so having a harm repair plan, which doesn't have to be extravagant, but what happens when we mess up? What happens when we screw up? What are we going to do to repair it and to move on from that and to learn from our mistakes?
Maria! That was good. Okay. I was taking notes while you were talking because there's so many things that I do not want to miss and I want to touch on. But in all capitals, I have harm repair plan. But keep that on your mind. Okay, I really like that you were talking about maybe you don't have to go into every graphic detail, right? So I think that's something that's really interesting because a lot of nonprofit leaders that I talk to, they'll struggle with that. They're like, how do we make people understand without showing them the conditions that people live in or like X, Y, and Z kind of train of thought? And it's something that I recently posted about on LinkedIn of you don't have to do that. The days of World Vision ads with overextended stomachs and like starving children are over. We can let them go. Yes, it works, but it's not ethical. And also, it also contributes to donor attrition. A donor is less likely to stay on long term when you guilt them into donating than when you empower them. It makes sense for the purpose that you're saying it makes sense for, which is collecting donations. When you were talking about sounds and the multimedia aspect of it, the imagery is just as an important part of the story as the story that you're telling itself. But yeah, the sounds piece too, like the sound of police sirens as well can be very triggering. Like the sound of heartbeats, as you were saying, can be very triggering. Just thinking about not only the story owner, as you mentioned them, but also the audience can be very hard. And I think I shared with you the story of a time where they had this trigger warning at the beginning of this fundraiser. The fundraiser is in a room with all wealthy, mostly white women, and it was run at a community foundation, and they say, "Hey, we're going to tell a story and it's going to be triggering. A references SA, and we want to be like really cognizant of the people who are like in the audience." By that point, obviously I don't want to hear this. Who wants to hear that? But there's no way to escape as an audience member, right? So at least with some other things that's not in person, that's not a gala, that's not an event, you can turn it off. But when you're in that captive audience situation where you have your donors who might also have experienced domestic violence or some sort of incident that has caused trauma, and you're saying, oh, this is just a trigger warning, there is no actual real opportunity to escape and remove yourself from that situation. So, are there things that nonprofits can do during fundraisers to eliminate that risk for their attendees, whether they're community members or donors?
Yeah, I love that example so much because it's almost a catch 22 because you do want to give choice to your audience. There has been times where I have sat and received an incredibly painful story, an experience that is so far from my own, and it's changed my heart and my mind, and I've become dedicated to a cause. But it's been my choice to listen to that story. I was held captive, like you said, in a room. And there have been many times because of my lived experiences that I just don't have the capacity to listen and hear it. And it's really easy when you're reading to be like, nope, that's not for me, or watching a video, you can press pause. But at an event, it is difficult to be the one that like stands up and leaves a room with 300 people in it. Yeah. And in one sense, we do want to give. And so for that, and it's really tricky, Maria. I wish I had a really clean answer for that. But that's the thing with trauma informed storytelling and marketing and fundraising is that a lot of it comes down to choices. So I would say if it's in an event And it's going to be hard, even with a content or trigger warning, for folks to leave the room. I would try to spare some of the most difficult details. And instead of saying for the next 45 minutes, this is going to be difficult, so you can leave, maybe the speaker can say, hey, for the next minute, I'm going to talk about violence or I'm going to talk about suicide. And so even if that is just giving someone an opportunity to zone out for this short amount of time, right? So being extra sensitive to maybe save the more, let's say, graphic, difficult, really difficult, possibly re-traumatizing content for spaces where people really have the choice to opt out. And this
Yeah.
is really important because more and more folks are not just being mindful of the marketers and the fundraisers and communicators having this kind of training and understanding, but for folks to tell their own story and kind of know there's going to be opportunity. Maybe you're talking to police officers or hospital staff where it's this is the platform to really get into detail and paint a picture if you have capacity as that storyteller to really give important details on what this experience was like, how difficult it was. But if you're giving a speech to maybe a more general audience, that you're protective of them, being mindful. There's likely people in this room with your same exact life experiences. They're here to support you. They're here because they care about this cause, but it's going to cause a harmful human response to listen to the details. Yeah. And you know
There's
what? What if, Maria, what if someone says, I'm going to tell you that this was a difficult time and I'm going to name it. I experienced domestic abuse, or I was in a refugee camp, whatever it was. And at the end, if you really want to hear more about my story, I would love for you to watch this video at home and have those resources like a QR code or something like that. To me, that is like the future, right? The trauma informed future for nonprofits, to just give audience that choice. Like, I do want to know more, actually. Like, I didn't know this was happening on the other side of the world or in my own backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to something else. As I mentioned, PTSD. So
Mm.
as part of that, I can be a little bit of an overshare. Hello. you know, hello. It helps that person find safety and see their community and find people quicker. So that's like a part of oversharing. So when I have interviewed people, sometimes they have overshared with me to the point where it's I feel like a little bit traumatized hearing about this. So one notable example was when I interviewed someone who had experienced solitary confinement for 30 days. And just hearing about her treatment in prison and the way that she was like penalized outside of like court by the warden and all these things was horrible, was so harmful. And so it has nothing to do with the person who's telling the story, but it was just hard to hear. Are there tips that you would give the story receiver or ways that they can steal themselves or even what to do if they feel triggered in the middle of a story, right?
So you bring up something really important, and that is that us, the storytellers, are incredibly vulnerable to re traumatization or vicarious secondary trauma or all of the above. And this isn't something that may or may not happen. This is a big part of your role as a storyteller. Those of us in the nonprofit sector are here because we're solving really big problems. And so a lot of painful stories are going to come up. That's why the name of my programs and my podcast is When Bearing Witness, because I don't take that lightly, holding space for really painful, difficult stories and that impact that has on us as storytellers. So the first thing that I would say is to know and communicate your scope, which can be so difficult. So to be able to communicate that, thank you for sharing this really difficult story. And I am here to hold space and listen, but just know that I'm not equipped to support you in healing, and that's where you have resources with you, right? So what kind of accessible, and I love Katie Kurtz, one of my teachers, says if you're going to give resources, make sure it's within walking distance, like within a mile, which I know is difficult, but are there, whether it's like a hotline or something very accessible that you could say I can hear and I can sit here and sit with this with you. But here are resources, because some folks will treat you like a therapist because you're the first one maybe making that space for them to tell their story. Now, what happens if you're starting to feel triggered or re-traumatized during an interview? I would say do your best to ground yourself. Your nervous system is dysregulated in that moment. So this is something that is a skill, that is something that we should practice as storytellers. And that is, as they're telling, how can you listen, but also ground yourself? Maybe it's a mantra of I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm here, I'm safe. Maybe it's just paying attention to your senses, like holding something, even if it's a pen or pencil, just anything to ground yourself. Maybe pay attention if you're in a coffee shop, the smells that are in the room, anything that can just hold you in that space, in the presence. So your body, so this is the thing about trauma, Maria. What trauma is, it's a human response, and it's almost a disconnect with reality, because your body is saying you're in danger. So you're listening to someone telling a very dangerous story where they were in harm, and your body is hearing it and then thinking that they're in danger. So what you have to do is tell your body, actually, we're not in danger. We're here, we're present, and we're safe. So while that is happening in the moment, any way that you can try to be present and listen to the story, but also to the best you can, use your senses to ground yourself. And afterwards, this is why I wish that people after a really tough interview could take the rest of the day off, honestly. Like anything you could do to nurture yourself and to care for yourself for that rest of day or weekend. It's different for everyone how they nurture their nervous system. Music is really powerful. Pets are really powerful. Standing in sunshine. Not everyone likes yoga. Not everyone can meditate. I've been trying to meditate for 38 years. I cannot focus on meditating, but there are things that I can do. Sometimes just even being in my garden and getting dirt under my nails is like very grounding for me. Talking to my husband is very grounding for me. So what can you do afterwards? Is there someone in your organization that you trust, maybe a supervisor, maybe one of the program staff that has that more trauma responsive background that can talk you through that, so you're not going home with this heaviness of this difficult interview. So I think what I'm saying is there's a balance of setting boundaries, but also building resilience, and both take practice.
Even like when you're talking about grounding and like going through all these like self-soothing tactics, like that takes so much work, and that does take a lot of practice for it to become automatic of, okay, grab something that you can fidget with and calm your body in some sort of way.
Right.
And a lot of people don't even realize the, like the mind body connection of trauma. So just like having those like tactile things dirt
Right.
under your nails, a pet, like that can go a really long way.
You don't necessarily have to make it clear. And sometimes I have. I'll be honest. What a podcast episode that I interviewed someone, and there were more empty silences than ever because he was telling a story that was so upsetting to me. And he felt bad by the end of the view. Sometimes it's going to be obvious that the story is like upsetting for you. And I made it crystal clear. No, I consent to this. This is like an important conversation for us to have. But you can take breaks in your interview and just say, hey, that was a really hard story you just told. Let's take a 5-minute break and get a glass of water or take a quick walk for both of you. And you don't even have to say that it's for yourself, but you can carve out that space. And this is why I tell folks, just slow down every part of the storytelling process. Because if you carved out 20 minutes for that interview, it's not going to allow space for you to take that 5-minute break to just recalibrate, right? To just, again, ground yourself. But it is hard. That's two different things. Holding space for trauma and grounding yourself, that is a practice. That's a practice. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I said I want to go back to the harm repair plan. What is
Yes.
that? Tell
Yeah.
us.
So this is something on paper. So like when someone comes to you and they're like, the image that you chose with my story was really harmful, and this is why. Are you, that story that you published used language that was really insulting? Or oops, we published the first and last name of this person, then after the fact we learned that they were in intimate partner violence They just didn't know the situation, and now we put them in harm's way. So sometimes you absolutely don't even know, but it's a best practice not to use a last name, right? So you made a mistake, likely was unintentional, right? So we learn and move forward. But what you do, and so often as humans, that I find, especially in the nonprofit space, we're very reactive. So we're like, pull it down, let's blame someone, or worst case, we become really defensive. You didn't tell me. You should have told me that. Or I gave you a chance to review it and you never did. This is the last thing we want to do, is push the blame on whoever felt harmed by that story. So when you have something on paper, it gives you that guidance. And oftentimes, the very first thing that I have on a repair plan is to pause. So that means to say, I hear you and I see that you're hurt and I take responsibility. I need a moment to figure out what our next steps is. And that gives you a moment to do a few things. One, not to be reactive and especially to do something defensive, but also to do a little research. Sometimes people just are offended, and it really, maybe you just can't please everyone. And it might actually be worse to take it down, because what if it's somebody's story and somebody else was like, I'm offended by that language, but you can't please everyone. But if you're just grabbing the story down, it could just end up having an even more negative ripple effect. Pause, do a little research, talk to some other folks with similar lived experiences, talk to leadership, say, this is what happened. What's a good next step, right? The next thing after that pause is to apologize. And apologizing is another skill. To take responsibility for someone without being defensive and deflecting is incredibly difficult. So that's the second thing. The third is the repair. And the repair might involve the person who's been harmed, or it might not. Maybe they want to be part of that repair process. Would you be open to a conversation on what the next steps should be? Or let's not put that burden on the story owner. So give them that choice. Would it be helpful for you to be part of this process or not? And this, as I mentioned earlier, having a committee. If you already have a built-in committee in your organization, this is a great group to go to so you don't feel like on your own in this silo have to make a decision on what's next to repair this. So the repair is a decision that you shouldn't be making on your own. If possible, involve the person who has been harmed, if that's their choice. And who are other people that maybe different or more aligned lived experiences that will help you decide what to do next. And the last thing is to do it, right? To not only do it, but also let the person who's been harmed know what the steps are. We have we edited the story and had a line at the end saying that we've removed this because it was harmful, or we decided to remove the story altogether. And we have let everyone in the organization know not to use this person's image or story or whatever it may be, right? We made a plan, we implemented it, and then we let the person know that these changes have been made and how we will change in the future. We are going to change our protocol, whatever. The next thing is to change. Look at your protocols. Where was the broken link, right? What could have been? Maybe there wasn't. Maybe it was just this off day where something happened. But is there maybe, okay, now we're going to bring someone into the review process, right? What's a little thing you can do to prevent this from the future? And the last one is so important, Maria, and that is taking care of your own nervous system. After all is said and done, you can imagine the wreck that you would feel, right? Like, we're not in the space to do harm. And I know we do harm. We do harm all the time. Feels like sometimes it's intentional, right? And a lot of times it's unintentional, but it can just be dysregulating to apologize, to get everyone involved. There's guilt, there's shame, there's embarrassment. It's disruptive. After doing all that, taking some time to breathe, to ground yourself, to go for that walk, all those things that you would do after a difficult interview, you should do after the harm repair has been implemented. And I have to shout out again, Katie Kurtz, who's one of my teachers, who I learned a lot about the importance of having harm repair plans, because it gives us grace to be human. We can't promise that we'll do no harm. And that's why I say trauma-informed storytelling is resisting harm. It's not a promise not to do harm, but it is a promise to resist harm and to do what we can to promote safety.
Yeah, what's that quote? It's good to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
Right.
Just like a crisis comms plan or something like that. Like, just reduce liability, live up to your values. It's just helpful in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely.
Maria, is there anything else that you want to leave our audience with today?
I want to say that sometimes you can hear these things and look back at all the things that you've done wrong, and it can be paralyzing. And the last thing I want is for you to listen to this and think, I guess we shouldn't tell stories anymore. It's just there's too much at stake. And I want you to know that stories change the world and storytellers are making the world a better place. And I appreciate you for doing something really hard and difficult and messy, and to give yourself grace when you mess up and to release those mistakes that you've made in the past. And thank you for telling stories.
Don't compare someone's 100th step to your first.
Absolutely.
Maria, where can people find you to continue the conversation, follow your work, all that good stuff?
Yes, I host When Bearing Witness, which is a podcast on all things trauma informed storytelling. Maria, I'm getting you on. She will be a future guest. And you can go to my website, mariabryan.com, and learn more about my training and resources on trauma informed storytelling.
Well, I'll also include two resources in the show notes. So, one will be my dignified storytelling questions, and the other one will be the trauma informed storytelling toolkit by Maria. Guest Maria.
Other Maria.
Maria, it's been so great having you, Maria. Thank you so much for sharing all your very actionable, very applicable tips that I really hope our audience takes away from it.
This is an honor. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. Really like thinking about how we tell stories and the words, the imagery, the sounds, where we tell them. It's such an interesting topic for me. And I know that it's something that we all have to struggle through. As an additional note, if you want to see our lovely faces, you always can watch these episodes with videos on YouTube. But again, thank you for joining us today and thank you for being part of the conversation. And we'll see you next time. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.